Our Bible reading this week is in Luke chapter 22. We are getting close to the end, just two
Yeah,
more
that's right.
after this. And
That's right.
so knowing the gospel story, we can anticipate,
What happens now?
yeah, we're getting down to the end. And
Right.
so I think the big idea in chapter 22 will actually be the big idea in several of the coming chapters, and that is this is the crucifixion story. This is about the death of Jesus.
That's right. Absolutely.
So we're going to walk our way through the chapter. Just one of the things you can do when you read, just sort of follow the storyline of how Luke chooses to tell the story
Right.
and the pieces he chooses to include. Of course, he isn't alone in including the betrayal of Judas. That's our first little segment in verses 1 through 6.
Right.
Notice, and particularly look at verses 2 and 6, we see again the fear about the crowds.
Yes.
And they're worried about the enthusiastic support for Jesus. And we made the point earlier in one of the podcasts that really influences their behavior.
Right.
Here and what they're doing. And so we have the betrayal of Judas, followed by, beginning of verse 7, this Passover observance where they're going to institute the Lord's Supper.
Right.
Now you and I speculated about this, or at least you listened to me speculate about this this statement in verse 10 when they want to know how to meet up with Jesus. There's all this
Right.
intrigue going on.
Yeah.
Meet this guy, tell
Cloak
him
and dagger.
Yes, that's exactly right. Meet this
Yeah.
guy carrying a pitcher. He'll tell you where to go. And I'm wondering a little bit when I read that if this isn't Jesus aware of the danger, aware that they're looking for him, making arrangements in a way that would prevent his enemies from taking him too soon before he's ready for that moment, because he wants to observe the Passover with
Right.
them. Passover is going to be significant in all of
Right.
this.
Because the Passover is repurposed into the Last Supper. And so the original exodus of God's people from the slavery of Egypt now becomes the exodus of God's people from the slavery to sin. And so the Passover supper becomes the last, or Lord's Supper.
A lot of parallels.
That's right.
Between those two events.
right.
Then picking up at 24, I think this is a really interesting section because Luke chooses to place right in the middle of the momentous hour this petty dispute among the disciples
Right.
about who is the greatest.
Right.
And in fact, if we grouped everything from 24 to 38, you have this warning about Peter and how he's going to fail, and then the protests of Peter, and if I have to die with you, I'll
Right.
never deny you. And of course, because we have the rest of the story at
Right.
this point,
Right.
we know how awful that looks.
Yeah.
And then in 38, and tie that down to 49, we've got this whole thing with the swords.
Yeah.
So what do you do with this part about the swords?
Well, part of what's going on, you remember, if you go look in, part of the answer is the context. Verse 35, he reminds them, when I sent you out previously and told you not to take anything, did you lack? No, we didn't, because people were still supporting more Jesus' ministry, especially up in Galilee and what have you. Part of what he's trying to get them to understand, and this sits in the context of them still, very foolishly quarreling over who's the greatest, and Peter saying, I won't deny you. He wants them to understand that he now, verse 37, is to be numbered with the transgressors. Even among the Jews, Jesus will be declared a criminal. That's what this trial between the Jews and between Pilate and the Romans and the crucifixion is essentially doing. And so they need to understand now that they are going to have to take more preparation, including swords, sometimes a need for a certain, maybe limited form of self-defense, but certainly prudence. Because now they're going to be outlaws. This Jesus is going to be declared not the Messiah, massive legal consequences, crucifixion. They're going to be outlaws. And so now Jesus says, because I'm never among the transgressors, as my followers, you are outlaws. Take thought and prepare accordingly as you go and do the work of spreading my message. But in the garden, then, Jesus still intends to die, and so now is not the time to use a sword in that way.
So the beauty of all of that is that his closest disciples are just a mess through all of this.
Well, they still have no clue about what's really happening.
Well, and they're stumbling all over the
Right,
place, which, by the way, as you read this, watch for that and remember, nobody writing on their own would say these things about themselves or their friends.
Right.
These embarrassing details, I think, are powerful evidence that we're getting the story as it happened.
right.
So 39, we have the garden scene,
Right.
followed in 47 by the arrest where Judas brings the enemies to Jesus. And then, so you have that ugly incident. Then you have the denial of Peter that
Right.
follows before that section is done. And then the chapter concludes with sort of the beginning of the trial process. And this
right.
is this is going to be the Jewish phase
That's
of
right.
the trial.
And again, the way Luke wants to tell the story, we're going to see it's in the next chapter next week. He's much more interested in the Gentile side of it, Pilate and uniquely Herod. The Jewish side doesn't interest him nearly as much. He's writing to a more Gentile audience, and so how the Romans and which is what Pilate and Herod are about, because Herod's still a Roman representative under Roman authority to a certain extent. He's more concerned about that. We'll see that in the chapter next week. Jewish trial doesn't really fascinate him. He gets right to the point. They are convinced he's a blasphemer, and so off he goes to the next phase.
So that wraps up the chapter for us. Now, and as you're reading the chapter this week, don't forget we need to find ourselves here and realize that as God is bringing to a climax this great plan of His, all of this is being worked out for our salvation. And the interesting thing is to watch how, in essence, Jesus has to help them pull it off at
Right.
times, demonstrating not that this is being worked out against His will, but according to God's
Right.
will to provide the sacrifice for our sins. So keep that in your mind as you're reading through the chapter this week.